Hello, everyone, and welcome to TechWise. This is season 1, episode 2 of the series, where we'll be discussing navigating secure data access in the age of democratization. The purpose of this series is to provide expert opinion and insights into technology solutions, leveraging the wisdoms of Greenleaf and the perspectives of thought leaders within its extended partner ecosystem. My name is Craig Collier, and I'm your host of today's episode. We have a really exciting session today. Again, I've invited a friend along today to help me discuss this topic. We've become familiar with one another in our previous life working together when we both worked at Snowflake. He's a consummate professional in the area of information security and data access. And I'd like to introduce you to my good friend, Jonathan Sander. Jonathan, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing all right, Craig. I mean, any day I get to talk to you, right? So,
Silly guy. Yes. So tell me something. How did you introduce yourself first and foremost, but how
Mhm.
did you get into data and information security?
Whew. Okay, so I'll go in the order you gave it to me. So in terms of introductions, right, I invite anyone to go review LinkedIn if you want the whole story. I've written more there than most humans should. Currently, what I'm up to, I think one of the things that's going to be very relevant to this conversation as we get into some of the data security topics is I've been advising at a company called Asterix, but I'm doing a lot of advisory work and consulting work through my S Corp 42 Notions. If you're a Hitchhiker's Guide fan, you're going to get the name right away. And of course, right, Craig, you and I met at Snowflake, which is how it's Snowflake's fault that we're here,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Um, but how did I get into information security? I mean, so my first real technical job, and what I mean is I was in tech support for a while, but that was more about a customer support job than it was about technology. My first real tech job was I worked at a place called the National Kidney Foundation, the national branch of the Kidney Foundation. I wasn't there long, but boy, did I get like to look behind the curtain of IT systems and how they function, building the website and helping with big campaigns that involved actually. I wouldn't call it big data because we didn't have a lot, but we had we had databases and people accessing them. And I remember back then asking myself constantly, what happens if something goes wrong? Like, what happens if this access that we've given to this person who's dialing in from home, literally at that point, dialing in,
Mhm.
what if somebody like steals that? Like, and I didn't have real thoughts about it, but it did occur to me because I'm a pessimist by nature. And I was like, wait, what's going to happen when all this goes wrong? And then when I got into the vendor side of technology, started working at Platinum, I got my first look at, the serious approach to all of that. And I gravitated immediately towards the security solutions that Platinum had. And I've basically stayed with that through my whole career. I took some sort of sidelines into the more pure data
Mhm.
management world. I think that's how I ended up at Snowflake because I had sort of those two pieces in my DNA, right? The data management and the security.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's an answer to your question. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Cool.
that's you have an interesting journey. I mean, I like to talk when I think about you. I think about a person who's really interesting, had an interesting path. I mean, you got a lot of interesting stories. I mean, we've talked, enough for me to actually know that you've got a lot of interesting stories.
Well, we don't want to tell those
We
stories here, though,
won't
right?
tell
Yeah,
them
yeah. No,
all.
I was going to say, yeah. This is a whole different kind of storytelling, I think.
Right,
Right?
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Okay, good,
But
good.
yeah, I same thing with me, man. I got into data, messing around with Lotus 123 way back in the day. I don't want to date myself, but yeah, I mean, I do have a gray beard, so I'm not 20. But at any rate, but at the time, even then, we were trying to get
Mhm.
data in the hands of business users to make business decisions.
Right.
And when you think about that, I mean, that's really what democratization is really all about. Getting getting data into the hands of users
Yes.
so that they can actually make business decisions, manage their businesses effectively. That's really what we want to do. But we want to do it in a way that doesn't, put our businesses at risk, right?
Right.
I mean, so, when you think about modern tooling and, and democratization and how we're trying to get data there, in your opinion, how has the move towards data democratization impacted information security as a whole?
So, I mean, I might surprise you with this one, but I think it's been a net positive effect.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you why, because it's interesting. You bring up, right, your history with Lotus and trying to get people's hands on data back then.
Yeah.
We didn't have a data democratization program
Yeah.
at that point, right? That
Right.
was just like rogue pirate, like grab the data, shove it in a database, give it to some people. Security didn't even know it was happening,
Right.
right? Security literally might not have even understood that that was a thing that happened. And
Right.
that was, I think, the pattern for a long time with data, the business side was just, it kind of just got thrown around. The interesting thing about the move to formalize that into the programs that all fall under this umbrella, data democratization, is it gives security a way to actually attach to and have opinions about and impact the way that it's happening. Now,
That's interesting. I didn't even think about
security,
the angle.
yeah, but security's still in the back of the bus. Let's not be clear.
Right.
Like it's security is still last in line to be able to influence a lot of this stuff. They're often last invited to the party,
Right.
but now there's actually a party. It's not just like hanging out in some weird place. It's like a party, and there are invites going out, and security's getting them.
Right. Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
And so that means they actually get to participate. Right.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
a good thing. That's a
Yeah.
good thing.
But interesting enough that sometimes, businesses tend to kind of over rotate. They put the keys and the locks on a little bit too much, or you have two extremes, right? One is, not enough security and not enough data access where everything's just kind of willy-nilly. And then you have this, over rotation, which we've experienced a lot, where people are like, no, it has to be absolutely 100% locked down. You can't get access to it. And that's where, in my opinion, where shadow IT kind of rears its ugly head, where people start trying to do things to skirt the system as opposed to really trying to implement the system. So in my opinion, you need to build security up front, make people sign on to that. And we learned this well at our last company. I mean, we learned this well, right?
Yeah, I mean, so shadow IT was very good to us, you and I specifically, Greg,
Absolutely.
right? Like shadow IT was the way that Snowflake really weaseled its way into most of its early customers. And I mean early, like even like maybe up to the IPO, right? You had a lot of people who were doing shadow projects that would bring in Snowflake. But what's interesting is that Snowflake took a very specific kind of approach, and you see this in the major cloud service providers, and I would count Snowflake as one of those at this point, where they build security in, or at least the possibility to be secure, right into the way that the system itself functions, into the fabric of the platform. And what that meant was that, unlike other waves of shadow IT, right? Lotus again, right? Like you put that worm in my brain, I can't get rid of it, right? But that was a great example of shadow IT. There was tons of people building Lotus Notes apps that did all kinds of crazy things, right? With all kinds of data that they probably shouldn't have exposed to all the audiences that had access to that, right? We were a Lotus shop at Platinum, so I saw that firsthand too, right? So I saw that happening. But you look at the way Snowflake is built. Even from the very beginning, there were mechanisms to make it secure. And you could say the same thing, right, about Google Cloud. You could say the same thing about Azure. You could say the same thing about AWS. And I hear the question forming in everyone's minds, then why are all these S3 buckets getting popped?
Right.
Why are all these things happening to these cloud providers? I said the word can. For those who might not have had the benefit of a classical education, there's a difference between can and will, right? They can make it secure. That doesn't mean they will make it secure. They might do all kinds of bad things, right? They may, as one of my favorite sayings go, break into jail, right? They, by putting their data with absolutely no controls turned on, right? Because you do have to turn them on, right? I mean, some of the things are built in by default, right? So like all the cloud service providers just encrypt everything by default, which is better than what you had before. But you could give everybody admin roles, or build a single service account and give it admin role and have every application use just that service account. So there's ways to do it bad. But I would say that in general, the cloud service providers, even when brought in as shadow IT, had a better head start on being secure than a lot of systems that had been the shadow IT systems and the waves that came before them.
Yeah,
Does that
yeah.
make sense?
It's like, look, providing the tools to give you what you need, whether
Mm.
you use them or not, is one thing. Now, like you talk about the old job. I mean, our very first day on the job was orientation, and what was the first thing you learned? Security, right? It was like,
Yeah.
don't leave your laptop in your car and things of that nature. But it was just a heightened awareness around security, and I kind of wish that businesses outside of Silicon Valley took that same approach, to be honest with you, right? So, there's modern tooling has really been promoted to be cloud first, right?
Yeah.
And the thing about that is that there's ways to do it right and ways to do it wrong. And a lot of times businesses will really make special consideration for securing the infrastructure, right?
Hmm.
We do a lot of that. It's like, oh, we need to secure the infrastructure. We saw that when we used to kind of consult some of the Azure customers, right, that were trying to move data in between data centers. And we were like, well, you can't do it the way you're trying to do it because you've got too many rules in, right? So
Hmm.
there's a
Hmm.
way to do the rules right. But, besides infrastructure, what considerations need to be made for securing data access with the modern tool?
So what's interesting about a cloud first architecture is it challenges a lot of the mechanisms that security teams have traditionally fallen back on to
Mm-hmm.
build protections,
Mm-hmm.
right? And and I'll pick on my favorite one here, networking, right?
Yeah.
And this was, and you mentioned the cross-region stuff
Oh, yeah.
challenges we had with Azure, and that was all rooted in a very networking forward point of view on how to
Mm-hmm.
provide security.
Mm-hmm.
And the notion was, this sort of, I'll call it outdated point of view that if you have this hard shell that prevents people from getting in the first place, that means that you can not worry as much about the other pieces. And
Interesting.
and what's interesting is it's born out of a couple different things, right? I mean, first of all, it's a convenience factor in two dimensions, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
convenient for the people on the security side because often they were born out of the network because it was the first thing that actually caused any security issue. Because before there was a network to get to stuff, you could not get to stuff. So the entire idea of access control was less important in some ways,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because, like,
Just couldn't
so
get to it.
yeah, exactly. You can't get to it, so you can't get to it, right? So once you have a network, even an intranet, right, even an internal network where people in
Mhm.
building A can get to building B, right? That's where a lot of this stuff was born out of, right? And
Right.
so a lot of the skill set of the people who were, especially like the senior people who were thinking about the patterns and the architecture and the leadership of those people, they came out of a networking point of view, right? So
Mhm.
it's no shock that they took that point of view with them to every conversation.
Yeah.
But the other part of it, the other part of the convenience factor of focusing on the network, they didn't have control of data and applications.
Mhm.
Data and applications was in the hands of the business, which meant if you wanted to put controls in place that were RBAC based, if you wanted to put controls in place that were about application logic or
Mhm.
identity access management or all of these other layers, right?
Mhm.
You didn't have the leverage. You
Right.
didn't control it, right? So
Mhm.
it was convenient to say, no, 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 we'll be over here on the network side. You be over there in these controls. And, I'm going to have to do it. I'll have to use a buzzword, a buzz term, right?
Mhm.
In the era of zero trust, pause for people in the audience to throw tomatoes. Um, zero trust in my mind means something very simple.
Mhm.
Trust nothing, right?
Right.
Which means secure everything, which means you cannot say that because your network is well constructed, that means you don't have to worry about anything else, right? You
Mhm.
you have to build the right controls into every single layer. You have to assume that bad things can happen at any layer from any other layer. And in so doing, you build a true defense in depth, which is another buzz term that I don't mind as much,
Yeah.
approach. And I think when you look at the way that cloud first has impacted things, is it's forced that sort of thinking on a lot of organizations in ways that they weren't hoping to have to tackle as quickly as they did.
Right.
But as these cloud platforms came in and they realized that, like, literally the whole point of the cloud was to access it over the network,
Exactly.
and that the internal network wasn't theirs to control at all,
Hmm.
right? Like, literally, you can't even see some of those networking layers. It forced a reckoning in the approaches that
Yeah.
they would take. And they would have to take identity access management seriously. They would have to take all of the RBAC seriously. They would have to take the actual application control layers themselves, right?
Yeah.
Settings in the application that have security impacts. And, you know, that caused a lot of chaos
Yeah.
on the security side, right? It caused new tooling to have to appear to make the simplest but most annoying but most important part of security, inventory, possible, right?
Right.
I mean, because you can't lock down something you don't know exists, right? Back to
Yeah.
shadow
Sure.
IT, right? Like,
That's
the
what
idea
I
is you
see.
have to know it's there, right? And it's funny, right? So we mentioned, or I mentioned service accounts at one point. They're a great example of things people don't even know are there in a
Right.
lot of time, in a lot of times, right? Like, because especially in cloud systems, right?
Hmm.
They tend to look like any other account. So how do you know that this thing called, Craigman
Right.
is actually the account being used by your giant reporting system that is essentially the access layer for 90% of the humans
And that's
touching
something.
this system, right?
Yeah.
You can't tell that unless you do
It's
some serious
delegated
inventory.
access. Yeah. That whole
Right.
delegated access.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an issue.
But
Yeah.
that simple, idea of inventory, right?
Hmm.
That becomes a really big challenge in the cloud where, it's not all your stuff.
Yeah.
You're at least sharing custody.
Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting because when we talk about all the hardening of systems like you were just talking about, or the processes put in place, they mainly concerned getting access into the system, right?
Yeah.
Or infiltration, right?
Yes.
But does that make any notion for data exfiltration? We don't even think about that portion of it. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's probably a little bit more of the scary one because you talk about zero trust. You tend to trust folks on the internal side that can just at any moment just give up all the secrets, right?
Yeah.
Think
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's it's true for like a lot of different types of workloads. I mean, to use another buzzword nowadays, it's the whole AI revolution, right? Like, when you think about AI and ML, the goal, and you think about chat GPTs, and which is the classic example of an LLM and an AI, or
Hmm.
sort of like a conversational AI is the thing that people pretty much recognize more than anything. Requires a lot of data, right?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
requires access to a lot of data. But when you think about it, when people are training these models and when they're designing these models, you're giving people, humans, access to goo gobs of information that they may not have, or should not be privy to, because you really want the models to be trained on really raw data, not necessarily curated data, right? And in my opinion, these workloads have really created a potential for blind spots for
Hmm.
security access teams. I mean, again, the whole issue around data exfiltration. What do you think teams should do to address, the issue around, data exfiltration, or,
Yeah.
AI and ML, or where, access to increased amounts of data is required to do your job?
Yeah. I mean, wow. Talk about a big topic. We could spend 30 we could spend 30 minutes on that alone. Um, so I mean, I think first of all, the same thing we were just talking about comes into play here. There's an inventory issue, right?
Right.
I think a lot of people focus on the way the data teams are using ML, AI, but I'm going to actually give the data team some credit here.
Hmm.
They tend to actually be building systems consciously, right? They
Hmm.
know that a lot of the risk you're talking about exists because, frankly, it existed in their BI platform too, right?
Right.
Now it's got this, like, crazy virtual mind on top of it. Who knows what, like there's definitely different effects, but ultimately it's got a lot of the same access issues, right? Right back to service accounts, right? It's all like it's using a lot of the same patterns that you would use for
True.
BI and other things. But the thing is this, right? Inventory, man, inventory. There's all this AI stuff that people aren't thinking about. It's access to data and even data in odd forms. I'll tell you what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
As an organization, can you say every place that someone's turned on a Copilot,
Yeah.
right?
How about that?
Like, right? So do you know that you're not training your provider, be it Microsoft or whomever, on your IP? Do you know that you're not training your competitor on your IP? Because if you train the AI and the AI then understands insights that come from the insights from your people, and your competitor then tries to do something similar, and the AI's like, oh, actually, here's a great way to do, right?
Interesting point, Red.
Like, how do you know if
Right.
you're controlling for those things, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
very few solutions on the market that are able to put in the effort to actually even discover that, right? Give you the inventory of what's happening on a larger thing, inclusive of the data projects, but also all of these weird places that AI is intersecting workers and your IP,
Right.
right?
Right.
And then back to the exfiltration point, I mean, there are so many weird ways that you could exfiltrate data through AI patterns, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, if your data ends up in a training corpus, in the information that goes into the, chat GPT, PT, pre-trained, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before you use it, before runtime, it's trained. That's the training corpus of data. That's the data it absorbed, right? That's the big, OpenAI is taking 9 months and talking about fruits. I don't know, telling you that they're training the next thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's the pre-training. And if your data somehow ends up in there, well, essentially, the system that results from that training could just give it up. Do
Yeah.
you know if your data is in those corpuses,
Yeah.
right?
How about that?
And
Yeah.
then even beyond that, if you have a private model, which a lot of organizations are now doing, right? They're taking either, they're working with players like Collier, or they're just building from scratch based on the meta models or whatever it might
Mm-hmm.
be, right? Snowflake obviously has a big example here where you can, use its own Cortex systems with, various different models.
Right.
If you're building a private model, even, right? If you train that private model, even a RAG style later, on a bunch of information, do you know that if Jonathan is allowed to access some information, but Craig is not, if we
Mm.
both use that model, will the model know?
Yeah. How about
Then
that?
I'm supposed to know. And like, how does it handle that, right?
Yeah.
How do
Yeah.
you deal with those sorts of things? And again, not a lot of solutions there.
Yeah. It's tough
Excuse me.
problems.
Yeah, tough problems. And the best thing you can do, essentially, there are some systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Witness AI, for example, comes to mind, right? Good friend of mine has been working there for a little bit. That's why they come to mind. Who's solving these problems, right? But these are very, very, very hard things to do.
Right.
Genesis Computing, who I'm working with, it's a Snowflake platform
Oh yeah.
play. They're actually trying to solve these problems by keeping everything completely locked down inside the Snowflake ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of ways you could do it architecturally or from a security and control point of view. Yeah, but it's an open topic right
Yeah,
now.
it's interesting, man, because I didn't think about the loss of competitive edge. That angle is interesting, right? I mean, data is the currency that we all transact on, right? I mean, think about it,
Yeah,
right? I mean, you
yeah,
can monetize it, you can leverage it for again performance improvement. So it's important to kind of keep that thing locked down. That's an interesting topic. Speaking of that, back a little while ago, we were talking about data exfiltration.
hmm
Our last employer, I mean, there was a security incident. We don't want to relitigate this again. I mean, you wrote about it in Beyond Identity.
yeah,
A lot of the froth around it was, really miscast, in my opinion, right? I mean, you talk about a high profile security incident that was, totally just went in the wrong direction, right? Where actually it was really like a hygiene issue. Again, we talked earlier about, you know, like the cloud platforms will give you all the keys and the tools that you need to secure your network. They exist.
Yeah.
It's just that there's certain things that will just skirt the system. Like, for instance, if I left my truck running at at a Wawa, we have Wawas here in Pennsylvania. It's a very good.
I can forgive you for that. I can forgive you for that. Yeah.
Wawa's a good one. But like if I left my car running and I came back out, my car was missing. Is that Dodge's or Ram's fault? No, it isn't. It's my fault because I did that. Or if I left my keys in my front door and someone was walking by, saw the keys, and they decided, hey, look, let's go in and take this TV. I mean, of course, I mean, if you leave your keys in the open space or leave your car running at a place that's totally unsecure, you run the risk of having that problem. So it's, in my opinion, it's really more of a hygiene problem than anything. But
Yeah, it's
what recommendation would you make in regards to proper data access hygiene?
so let's think of it. Let's apply some of the lessons we already talked about.
Right,
Defense in depth,
right,
right? The whole way that incident occurred, it started with malware, right?
right,
It started with people's endpoints getting popped and people stealing credentials, right?
right.
A lot of people don't understand that there's like a bad guy economy, right?
Yeah, oh
And
yeah,
essentially, and there's specialized people, right?
yeah,
And there's people who specialize in infecting computers and stealing data.
that's
And
true.
here's the thing. I think we all picture sort of this movie-esque thing where they steal that data and then they use that data to break into this thing and they use that. And sure, that happens, but it's the exception, not the rule.
Right,
The
right, right.
rule is that you've got people who buy a bunch of data, and just like you said earlier, data can be monetized.
Yeah,
And so they take that bad guy data and they monetize it by selling it to more specialized bad guys who want to do specific things. And I'm making this much simpler because it's actually a very complicated market with lots of
mhm,
different players and specialists. But what it comes down to is at some point, some bad guy who was like, I bet that there's a lot of Snowflake accounts that are not secured beyond having a password. And I bet there's a lot of bad password management happening with those passwords because there's always bad password management happening
right.
because
Everywhere.
passwords are terrible,
Exactly.
right? And I even bet that a lot of those passwords are for service accounts that are
Mm,
over provisioned
yeah,
because service accounts are almost always over provisioned. And because of the way technology stacks work, often end up having to use passwords as their credentials.
right.
And that bet paid off,
Yeah,
right? They
yeah,
bought a bunch of data. They made an investment, right? They
yeah.
bought a bunch of data. They used it. They went around, and sure enough, um, I was in Las Vegas shopping with my wife for a purse, and by the way, it isn't nearly impossible to get my wife to buy stuff for herself. So I was super into
Wow,
like
really?
like let's get you this thing. Like I constantly look around this room. This is not a virtual background. I spend a lot of money on my hobbies. I love it when I can get her to spend money on
Yeah,
herself. And I had to be on the phone the whole time because it was the day that everything went down, and like
yeah,
just everybody wanted to talk to me for good, bad, or for worse reasons. And it was just basically a bad guy on a day that ends in Y. They were
yeah.
doing what they do, breaking into things, stealing things. Snowflake, to their credit, has now come out and put more controls in place to help make
Exactly.
it even harder for that to happen.
Mhm.
Were there controls before? Yes. Was it plausible to think of ways that you could have used them in practical ways, especially with service accounts, to
Yeah,
lock them down? It's hard. It's
yeah,
hard. If it
yeah.
wasn't hard, we wouldn't be standing here talking about it, trying to inform people. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Service accounts, like, we've been talking about this a lot. I mean, it's the blessing and the curse, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, you think about computer to computer or service to service communication requires delegated access,
Yeah.
typically through a service account. And for a long time, service accounts were, again, you talked about it, Craig man. I mean, what
Hmm.
is that? I mean, it's, how do you know, right? It's like you're purpose or repurposing a user account as a
Yeah.
service account that may have elevated permissions. I mean, and so like, when you think about it, think about the cross region stuff we had to do, network policies and
Hmm.
around, using some type of credential, like, but service accounts are again a challenge, right?
Yes.
In your current work now, I mean, I know you're working with asterisks.
Yeah.
around, secure service accounts, or even is it credentialless? Talk to me a little bit about, the challenges of service accounts and how things in your current work.
Sure. So, I mean, I think first of all, you nailed some of the challenges here, right?
Yeah.
Service accounts are a necessary evil. Maybe even that might be too harsh. Maybe they're not evil inherently, but they are necessary. That's for
Right.
sure. And there's a lot of, I think the main failing around service accounts is actually in the platforms themselves often, right? We used to lament that essentially we would get on the line with people when I was at Snowflake and talk about like, how are we going to access Snowflake? And, the human stuff was great, right? The human stuff, it was single sign-on, it was OAuth, it was SAML, it was excellent. We loved it, right? We had great lockdown, and most of our customers ate that up.
Right.
Non-human identity would be a whole other story because, they basically say, and I don't want to name names, but like, oh, I have this BI platform and it needs to be able to talk to Snowflake and, go build reports and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, great. So that's going to be a very highly privileged account that has access to lots of different domains of data. How are we going to secure that account? Well,
Right.
On the screen where you configure it, there's only space for a username and password. Oh, great. Just
Right.
awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect. That's just beautiful, right? And, that was the reality. And it still is to a large degree, right? Now, what's interesting is this area of non-human identity, which is what it's emerging now. We're saying service accounts, but service accounts really is a subcategory of non-human identity. You mentioned
Right.
APIs, right? There's lots of API keys and all sorts of things that are not passwords and not even associated with what we would consider traditional service accounts, but they fall under this idea of non-human identity. Asterisk and others essentially are building solutions that focus on that are trying to essentially lock that down in a similar manner to the way we've already locked down human identity. Because the thing is this, right? When you look in like something like Entra ID, Active Directory,
Right.
and you want to like understand who is Craig Collier and what does he have access to, there's pretty sophisticated ways to do that now, right? You can actually get a pretty good idea. That's not the case for a lot of these service accounts, right? What was the first problem? Inventory, right? Like you don't even know where they are half the time. You certainly don't know what they have access to, their authorization patterns, and you certainly don't know how they're being utilized.
Yeah,
One of
exactly.
the biggest problems with service accounts is not how they are used in their proper context, but the fact that humans will say, oh, that Craigman account, I know the password for that, and my human user doesn't have access to that data, but the Craigman account does. I could just use that login, and I could just grab that data because my boss is screaming, because his boss is screaming, because her boss is screaming, and they're all mad, right?
Yeah.
They're all mad, and they want this data now. And if I
Right.
just use that Craig account,
It's funny,
I can get it.
Jonathan. I did a lot of work in my past life with SQL Server, right? The SA account, right? I mean, it's like,
Oh, yeah.
you know what I'm talking about? I mean, you don't have access. Okay, let's just hack into the SA account and just willy-nilly do whatever you want
And
to
like you weren't really thinking about a bad thing, but even the natural word was to use was hack. There wasn't like you're doing wrong when that's the word that comes to mind, right?
do. Exactly
And
right.
so essentially, non-human identity is the practice now of trying to lock all that down. And what's interesting is, to a certain degree, I think a lot of it is just understanding inventory, getting a sense of where these things are. You can control what you can see, right? That's what it comes down to. And Asterisk certainly that's like a big focus for what they do. But you mentioned like are they credentialless? A lot of that depends on the platforms because again, if the little configuration screen where the platform needs to access the database, whatever it is, Snowflake or whatever, if all it lets you do is username and password, it doesn't matter that the other side, right, Snowflake perhaps has all of these big fancy things it can do to support it because the other side doesn't know how to speak to
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
But at least if you know that, you can put other compensating controls in place. And there are ways to do it through rotation, through other kinds of orchestration, right? So at least the password doesn't stay the same for 3 years, right?
Yeah.
But so like at least you have some capability to put some compensating controls in place to make sure these very powerful, useful
Yeah.
credentials are not like out in the wind.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Man, you always offer so much insight. How can our viewers, I mean, because we're almost out of time, I believe, how can our viewers either get in touch with you, learn more about you? I mean, do you have preferred place for them to check you out?
I didn't expect this question. I mean, LinkedIn is usually the thing I tell people, right? So
Right.
if you just look up Jonathan Sander there, you can reach out via email, sander@42notions.com. And if you've got a comic book store in your town and there's a technology conference, good bet you might find me there flipping through issues. If like you want to try to tap me on the shoulder with my noise canceling headphones on, which is like how my usual comic book store mode. But in all seriousness, no, I welcome people to approach. Most of my business is inbound people approaching, so I guess I should encourage that.
Right.
But yeah, LinkedIn is the easiest thing to do.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's awesome. Hey man, it's been a pleasure. Let's stay in touch. I mean, obviously, we will. I mean, I hope.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it's been really helpful.
You, me, and your whole audience, we'll all stay in touch.
That's right.
Drinks at Craig's house in an hour. How about that? There you go.
We'll all be there. There you go. Barbecue on me.
That's it. There you go.
All right, Mr. Sander. It's been good talking to you.
It's a pleasure, Craig. Thank you.
Talk to you soon. Yes, that was Jonathan Sander of 42 Notions. He also is consulting for Asterix today, which is an identity management platform. Again, this is our second episode of a series where hopefully that we'll be, having much more of these throughout the course of the year. But if you don't get a chance to, join, you can always look up us on YouTube at the Greenleaf Consulting Group. You can also follow us on LinkedIn at Greenleaf Consulting Group, Inc., and also on our website at greenleafgrp.com. We're going to have a lot of exciting events coming up soon. As a matter of fact, we're going to be doing a hands-on lab coming up in January at our offices in Ambler. We look forward to seeing you there if you can make it. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, talking about navigating secure data access in the age of democratization. Again, my name is Craig Collier for Greenleaf TechWise. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.